this call here. This is Ayo in Texas. Am I saying this right?
Dan?
Hey.
Yes, sir.
Ayo, I like it. That's a good name. So I see here that you want to talk about the historical Jesus, right?
Yes.
Okay, give me some background on what you want to talk about here.
Okay, well, I've been debating with this dude online, and he's telling me I'm being foolish for not accepting the biblical scholars' claims that Jesus was a real man in literal, like, non-metaphorical speaking, just like, and I'm not convinced of this. I don't think the scholars are, I don't think they have enough evidence to even, I don't even see how it's even something that's educational.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a debate that I'm seeing more and more happen. This idea that the historical Jesus may not actually, be a thing, right? That the collection of works that we have now that are talking about Jesus are really more of a mythical idea of a man, or their stories told, but they're not actually in reference to a real historical person. And you're right in the sense that most biblical scholars, do concede that Jesus was a real person, but there is a minority of scholarship who says the other way. I got to talk to Richard Carrier last year, who's one of the guys who is a Jesus mythicist, as they call it. I've read his book, and I've read some other people, who talk about this stuff as well. And it is fascinating.
I'm familiar with him.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It's a fascinating talk because the stuff that we have now about Jesus. I mean, if it comes to the stuff that's actually in the Bible, right? Most scholarship dates that back to about 70 AD at the very earliest. And we're talking about like the book of Mark, okay? And that's like not in the time frame of like Jesus being alive. Like that's a couple decades afterwards. And of course, there's apocryphal books as well, but there's this, we don't have any contemporary works of Jesus, which is, one of the arguments that's made. And there's some other stuff too about, the actual text itself we'll talk about, but it is kind of fascinating. Do you have a specific take on this, Mr. Bear?
Oh yeah, I'm not convinced. I don't see how we can jump to that conclusion that he was in fact a real person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go for it, Mr. Bear.
I have a couple of ideas about this. I think that perhaps he may have been real. He most likely wasn't white. And perhaps none of the supernatural claims of him has been documented anywhere outside of the Bible. So he most likely was a real man. Another idea I had was reading more into it that I have been recently, that perhaps there's an idea that it was a number of people combined. There may have been a few charismatic preachers at that time that shared similar forward-thinking ideas and were perhaps combined over time through the rewriting of scripture. That's one idea. A couple of ideas that I have there. I think that most likely he was real in terms of what he did, less likely so.
So, Ayo, you're taking the stance of just absolutely not, super skeptical, definitely not a real person. What has convinced you of that claim that Jesus never even existed?
What convinced me that he's not?
Yeah, so like, obviously most people claim that he was a real person. So like, where does your skepticism lie?
Because the only thing we have to rely on is some writings that are ancient historical writings, but the Bible doesn't line up with history completely. I mean, so it kind of falls apart for me. Mm-hmm. And there's no any other evidence outside of the Bible that can cooperate with it. Other than, they bring up the Josephus and that other person that starts with an S. I can't remember his name, but it's just they say very little about. I just don't see how anybody could be fully confident that he was an actual person.
Yeah, so I think the three of us would probably agree, right? Like the claims about Jesus, you know, we're pretty skeptical on that, right? All the miracles and stuff, the things that happen. I mean, like, you know, I think all of us would be in agreement here that that's probably not the case, right?
Yeah, I agree.
But, you know, it is a more interesting question, I think, of, well, was he even a real person? And like that would really change the scope of a lot of things, right? Because especially if we're talking about the New Testament, if we're talking about, you know, the Gospels, it mentions all kinds of other people as well. And so like that would question, you know, the historical legitimacy of like a whole bunch of these kinds of people in the Bible that talked about are in reference to Jesus in a lot of ways. One idea I think that's interesting is that Jesus was just kind of this conception of Paul, you know, and the Jesus that we know now is the result of like a fabrication on his end and stuff. I mean, there's lots of little rabbit trails you can follow on this, and it's definitely worth a look into if you haven't already looked into this already. I would say, for my sake, I'm a little more 50-50 on this. I'm definitely skeptical of the consensus from biblical scholarship because, like, you know, scholarship does change over time and stuff. And I've looked into a lot of, again, what Carrier and other people have written, but I'm not 100% convinced that he wasn't either, only because there's just a lot of questions that I would have to answer, I suppose, you know, because we're talking about a lineage of people who were, you know, it questions the whole idea of the origination of Christianity itself. You know, I'd have to wonder how a lot of these Christian ideas specifically came into place, and there's some explanations for it, but it's definitely not a completely clear picture, right? So yeah, that'd be my take on it.
No, it's not.
Mm-hmm. So
it's not a completely crystal clear picture at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that's why I can't concede, you know, whenever I'm talking to somebody who's telling me, oh, he was for real, and I'm like, you're gonna have to have more than that. I'm not for like, oh, let's just erase, you know, the Bible from our catalogs of books and stuff like that, you know, but just not putting it into practice. Like I'm just, prayers don't work. You know, nobody's going to figure out how to walk on water. Jesus didn't leave us any methods on how to turn water into wine or anything like that. It's just, it's impractical to use in our daily lives. And I see it as a division being made in cultures, you know, who's right and wrong.
Sure.
I just see it as being used as something that is divisive, and it should just be taken as a book of stories. You know, it's a mythology to me.
Yeah, no disagreements here as far as religion being divisive, right? I think you're in good company as far as at least for my guest this week. You know, I get a lot of different kinds of people and their opinions on here, but yeah, like there's definitely something to be said there, AO, about like what these stories can do, and like something about like how we interpret history. You know, really changes the way that we view the world, right? If we accept certain historical narratives to be true, then that can definitely lead us, you know, in different kinds of directions. I mean, there's so many examples you can point to this in history, and one of them is this idea of America being a uniquely Christian nation, and some of the things behind that. You know, like, and
man, can I jump in real quick?
Go for it.
I have to say this. I have to say this, and I see it happening in my little town that I moved into about 4 years ago. The courthouse, at first, I thought was a church. They have 4 giant crosses on each side of the courthouse. For the first couple of years, I thought the courthouse was a church.
Oh, you got to call the FFRF on those guys, right?
Yeah, I have actually talked to FFRF, and they have already made contact with the courthouse, and boy, did it stir up some stuff.
Really?
Oh my goodness. Oh yeah. It did.
I bet. Like, because that's people, man, when you mess with that stuff, people really get mad. Like, especially, I don't know where you live, but where I live, yeah, especially like in the Texas area, maybe not so much in Austin, but, like that can really, really mess with people's egos. It's like, this is ours. This is our Christian nation. We are founded on the 10 Commandments. And you're like, you can't change this. This is who we are. And you're attacking our identity, and,
Yeah.
that's what it boils down to.
Yep.
Well, Ayo, that was a fun conversation. I'm glad we could talk about that at least a little bit. I mean, there's so many intricacies to, the scholarship on this kinds of stuff. And you mentioned the Josephus passage and just all kinds of stuff. I mean, like, one day maybe we'll have to go in depth a bit more on that kind of stuff for someone who's like super skeptical, who can bring up all the facts on that kind of stuff.
I think it's kind of funny because whenever I really started to call myself an atheist, I started digging into the Bible even more than whenever I was just on the border, being like, oh, I'm agnostic, the possibility of God is
right.
It's possible. But since I've become an atheist, I research it so much more than I have ever. Even whenever I was a Christian.
Yeah.
I feel
That's true for a lot of us. Definitely.
Same with me. Yep, yeah, absolutely. Same with me.
Mr. Bear was an ex-Catholic, so he never read the Bible when he was, religious anyway, right?
Only the New Testament.
What was that?
I just making a joke because I grew up around Baptist circles, and the idea that they always said about Catholics was that they never read the Bible anyway. So
that's right.
It was just coming from that, but yeah, it's definitely good to look into what you believe in, right? Good to read the books that you supposedly say are all true. And yes. We certainly did. So here we are, right? So we encourage other people, read your books, read what it says, and then we can talk about them.
Can I just say,
yeah,
I started that way. I started completely dismissing Jesus as a real person as well until I looked into just all I'd say is just branch out more, keep researching, and you'll see that there's probably some fairly good basis for it, but still there's nothing definitive.
Yeah, it's an open conversation. It's definitely something that's one of those ones where it's like, you say you never know, we'll never know, and then we figure out more stuff. I don't know if that's one that we'll ever know, just because we're talking about a very an ancient time period that we can only get so much data from, and we're only going to ever get less over time, as stuff from that time period fades away. So, but it is good to talk about. It is good to kind of question these assumptions that we've always had about stuff. So I say good.
Well, maybe he might return one day.
He might return one day, and then if he does, then I guess we'll know. But until then, I'm not going to hold my breath, right? Well, Ayo, thanks for calling. Really do appreciate it, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too, man.
All right, take care.
See you.
Yeah, historical. I think, you know what it is? I think when you first deconvert, I think you kind of get into a frenzy of research. I think that's pretty true for a lot of people. I know it was true for me, right?
Well, I've done the most research in the last year than ever before.
Yeah. And I'm like less, I feel like, I've read enough now to where I don't have to, when I do my deep dives, they're just like every once in a while. They're not like every day like it used to be. But it is kind of a habit that people can get into because it's just like, it's a whole new world that's kind of open to you. You know what I mean? It's just
a whole new universe, really.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and it's cool to be able to talk about it with other people who are also interested in that kind of stuff. Because, like the stuff that you and I know, Mr. Bear, and the stuff that probably Ayo knows, if we talk to a lot of our Christian friends, like they either would have never guessed or like wouldn't believe us, and then would have to look into it themselves, and then it's a whole thing, right? It's there's leaps and bounds that you have to cross.
Exactly right. What compounds it as well? What compounds it is that when you actually come out as atheist, you actually get the backlash from other Catholics or Christians or whatever it was you're deconverting from. So that's another level that comes back to you.
Yeah.
When you expose yourself that you never had before.
Mm-hmm.
You're constantly questioned. You're constantly being told you never believed. You're constantly being told, well, you never receive the Holy Spirit, etc.
Yep.
It just goes on. It's another level on top of learning everything else.
And that backlash is what causes us to even form groups here, like the atheist community of Austin and other stuff, right? Because it's like, now, well, we got to talk about it to somebody, right?
That's right. Yeah, but we have to let it out somewhere.
Yeah, for sure. And so I don't know, it hinders it almost in a way when that backlash happens. It doesn't help them at all. But that's why we have shows like this. So